Pam Bondi stood in the back of the courtroom, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, the fabric of her navy blazer pulled taut with tension. The room buzzed with hushed murmurs and the soft shuffle of papers, but her eyes were fixed on the bench, locked on the figure of the judge who sat with solemn detachment behind the towering oak podium. The case had spiraled out of control over the past weeks, testimonies twisted, evidence buried beneath procedure, and the defense seizing every moment to manipulate perception. The prosecutor's voice droned, methodical and cold, laying out, his closing arguments with the dry cadence of someone convinced the verdict was already sealed. Pam had listened to enough. The truth pulsed in her veins like fire. She had studied every page, every deposition, every missed angle. The wrong person was about to be condemned. She could see it unfolding in slow motion, each word another stone sealing the tomb of justice. The judge lifted his gavel, pausing slightly as if sensing the undercurrent of unease in the room. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, smug and silent, fingers laced over his stomach like a man who'd already tasted victory. And then Pam moved. She stepped forward, deliberate, fierce, unstoppable, her heels cracking sharply against the marble floor, the sound slicing through the courtroom's stagnant air. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting with the precision of a blade. "I have to speak, now." Gasps echoed from the gallery. The prosecutor turned, his eyes wide with disbelief. The judge's gavel slammed down once, warning, authoritative, but not final. "You're out of order, Ms. Bondi," the judge said, voice strained with restrained irritation. "This is not your place. Sit down." But Pam didn't move. Her voice rose, not in volume, but in gravity, weighted with something raw, something undeniable. "It is my place, because if I sit down now, Your Honor, an innocent person will be locked away for the rest of their life, and you will carry that on your conscience." The room fell silent. Even the bailiff hesitated, hand hovering over his holster, but unsure of what to do. The judge's jaw tensed. His fingers twitched slightly, a tell he'd once been known for, when faced with doubt. He looked down at Pam, and for a moment, just a flicker, his eyes betrayed uncertainty. Pam stepped forward again, softer now. "You've heard only one version of this case, but I have documentation that was omitted deliberately. I have a witness who wasn't allowed to speak. I have everything you need to see this for what it really is, not justice, but strategy, not truth, but manipulation." The judge stared at her, his mind wrestling with order, decorum, tradition, and the weight of possibility that she might be right. The defense attorney stood now, barking objections, but they seemed distant, irrelevant. The air felt electric. Something ancient and primal stirred, the thirst for truth. Pam reached into her bag, hands steady, and drew out a thin folder, dog-eared, but immaculate in its importance. She didn't hand it to anyone. She held it like a torch. "You need to read this. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now." The judge looked at her, then at the folder, then at the silent crowd of spectators leaning forward in their seats like a wave about to crest. Seconds passed like hours. Then, slowly, he gestured for her to approach the bench. Pam Bondi's breath trembled just once before she moved, every step heavy with meaning. This was not how cases were won, but sometimes the law needed to be shaken awake. Pam approached, the bench with the solemn weight of someone carrying both evidence and consequence. Every eye in the courtroom followed her, the faint rustle of bodies shifting in seats the only sound as she moved. Her shoes tapped lightly against the polished floor, echoing like footsteps through a cave, each step marking a departure from tradition and an entry into something uncharted, something dangerous, but necessary. The judge's fingers curled. Over the edge of the bench, his knuckles pale, his expression unreadable. But he didn't stop her. That was everything. She reached the bench and placed the folder down before him with a reverence that bordered on sacred. Her hand lingered on the cover, fingers trembling now that the weight of what she was about to expose had come to rest fully on her. The judge didn't open it right away. His eyes stayed locked on her, as if trying to read her soul before he read her words. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly, his voice stripped of courtroom formality, the way a man might ask a question in the dark when he's afraid of the answer. "It came to me from someone inside," Pam said, her voice low but unwavering. "Someone who couldn't speak up because of threats. I vetted every page. I compared signatures, timestamps, chain of custody logs. It's real, and it changes everything." The defense attorney was on his feet now, storming toward the bench, his words sharp and cracking like gunfire. "This is highly irregular, Your Honor. She's not part of this trial. She has no standing. You cannot allow this circus to continue. This is contemptuous." But the judge held up a hand, silencing him not with volume but with command. It was the kind of gesture that could end wars or start them, depending on what followed. "Sit down, counselor," the judge said, never, taking his eyes off Pam. "She's already risked more than you'll ever understand by coming forward. I want to see what's in this file." The defense attorney stood frozen, seething, and then retreated, muttering beneath his breath as he dropped into his chair. The entire courtroom held its breath as the judge opened the folder. The silence was heavy, reverent. He flipped the first page and scanned its contents. His brows twitched. A slow inhale through his nose. The second page. His eyes widened, slightly. He reached the third, the fourth, his face shifting from disbelief to dawning horror. "These records," he murmured, "they show the forensic evidence was altered. The lab technician wasn't even certified at the time of testing." Xiaonai nodded. "And the defense built their case on that exact report. That report was never supposed to be entered into evidence. It was swapped in at the last moment. The original was buried." The judge flipped through the rest of the documents, his lips pressed in a tight line. "And this affidavit, this is from the technician himself," Pam pointed. "It's notarized. 3 weeks ago. He finally broke." The judge leaned back in his chair, hand to his mouth, and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. No one spoke. Even the court reporter had paused, her fingers poised above the keys like a pianist before a note. The weight of what had been revealed hung in the air like thick fog, wrapping around everyone in that room. "You realize," the judge said finally, his voice hoarse with restrained emotion, "if this is true, it means not only has a miscarriage of justice occurred, it was orchestrated, intentionally." Pam looked directly at him. "Yes, and if you let it stand, you become part of it." The words landed like a blow. The judge stared at her, and something in his face cracked, a line of exhaustion and anger long buried beneath robes and rules. Slowly, he stood. He didn't bang the gavel. He didn't announce anything. He simply turned to the court clerk and said, "Clear the room. Recess for 1 hour. Counsel and Ms. Bondi will remain." The bailiff began to usher people out, murmurs growing louder, confusion mixing with curiosity, but the judge's command was ironclad. Soon the gallery was empty, the doors shut, and only the players who mattered remained. The judge turned back, to Pam, his eyes now burning with a new fire, not just of curiosity, but of purpose. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Tell me everything you know." Pam took a breath as the heavy courtroom doors clicked shut behind the last person. The air inside was still, dense with expectancy. She stood there before the judge, her heart pounding but her voice steady as she spoke. She reached into her briefcase again and pulled out a small leather notebook, frayed at the edges, filled with handwritten notes and pages marked with red tabs. She placed it gently beside the folder. "It started with a phone call," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I wasn't even involved in the case, not officially. I'd been following it like everyone else, watching it slip further into the abyss. But then a man called me, said he had information, said he couldn't sleep anymore, that someone was going to take the fall, and it wasn't the right someone." The judge narrowed his eyes. "Who was he?" "A janitor," she said, glancing down at her notes. "He worked night shifts at the city's forensics office. He saw things, paperwork being switched out of envelopes late at night, labels scraped off and replaced. He thought maybe he was imagining it, until he started taking pictures. Pam slid a small stack of photographs from the notebook and handed them up. The judge accepted them wordlessly, eyes scanning the images. Blurred shots of evidence lockers opened after hours, hands wearing latex gloves holding up documents under lamplight, time-stamped photos that told a story without needing a single word of narration. The judge's face darkened with each photo. He swallowed hard, lips twitching. "These weren't shown to anyone?" he asked. Pam shook her head. He tried. He went to his supervisor. She told him to stay out of it. Then he got a warning in his locker, a note with no signature. "Shut up or go missing." He quit 2 days later. That's when he called me. The defense attorney interjected, his tone mocking, as if grasping for anything to slow the landslide. "So we're trusting the word of a janitor now? That's what passes for credible?" Pam turned her head slowly, eyes locking on him like a blade, being unsheathed. "That janitor has more courage in his hands than your entire firm has in its foundation. He risked everything while you were busy cashing checks built on lies." The judge raised a hand, silencing the exchange, though he didn't reprimand her. He turned his attention back to the notebook, flipping through it slowly. "This goes beyond a mishandled case. This is systemic, coordinated." Pam nodded. "That's what I was trying to tell you. It's not just about the defendant. It's about a pattern, a history, 3 other cases, you all with the same lab, same technician, same lawyer." The judge's eyes shot up. "This lawyer?" Pam paused. "No, his predecessor, the one who retired last year under a sealed agreement. But this one," she gestured toward the current defense attorney, who now sat with his mouth drawn into a tight line. "He learned from the best and kept the tools." The judge's hand shook slightly as he turned another page. He looked older now, not in years, but in weight, like he was suddenly carrying the burden of every verdict he'd ever passed down. He rubbed his forehead and leaned back, sighing. "How deep does it go?" he asked. Pam took a step forward, lowering her voice. "There's a vault beneath the city hall, locked records, sealed with bogus national security labels. But they're not classified. They're just inconvenient. I've seen glimpses, enough to know they don't want the truth coming out. And they're willing to destroy anyone who tries." The room felt colder suddenly, though no one had moved. The shadows seemed darker in the corners, the fluorescent lights above flickering faintly like failing stars. The judge looked around, as if realizing that the room he'd always considered a place of law and order had become something more sinister, a battleground disguised in marble and silence. "And what do you want from me?" he asked quietly, his voice stripped of pretense now. "To reopen the case? To throw out the verdict? To start a war?" Pam's eyes did not waver. "I want you to do what's right, not what's safe, not what's comfortable, what's right." The judge stared at her, and in that moment, the weight of decades settled between them. He could feel the eyes of every man and woman who had ever stood before him in judgment. Every life changed by a stroke of his pen. Every soul either freed or condemned. "Then I need more," he said finally. "I need testimony, sworn. I need corroboration. I need names. I need everything." Pam nodded. "You'll get it. I have a witness coming forward tomorrow. He's in protective custody tonight. He was part of the original investigation. He's ready to talk. And when he does, it's all going to collapse." The defense attorney stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. I move for an immediate dismissal of this entire circus. You cannot allow rogue testimony, fabricated files, phantom witnesses." The judge rose slowly from his bench. "Sit down, Mr. Caro, and shut up. One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt. If there's even a grain of truth in what's been presented today, then you're not defending your client. You're burying the system that made you." Mr. Caro slumped back into his chair, his face pale, the confidence drained from him like color from a dying flame. The judge turned back to Pam, his voice steadier now, harder. "Ms. Bondi, I'm going to call an emergency in-chambers review. You'll present everything. Tonight. If what you've said is true, I will move to suspend the current proceedings and issue a formal inquiry. But know this. If you're lying, if you're manipulating me, Pam cut in gently. I'm not, I never would. The judge studied her a moment longer and then finally nodded. Then we may be on the edge of something far bigger than this courtroom. Pam stepped back, heart racing, her breath shallow. The wheels had begun to turn, and there was no turning back now. That night, the judge's chambers were transformed, from a space of quiet deliberation into the eye of a growing storm. Thick files covered the long mahogany table, the glossy surface barely visible beneath layers of papers, photographs, digital transcripts, and sworn affidavits. The clock ticked steadily toward midnight, but no one paid it any mind. Fluorescent. Lights buzzed softly above, bathing the room in a cold, sterile glow, while the tension wrapped around everyone like invisible wire. Pam sat at the far end of the table, her notes spread before her with surgical precision. Across from her, Judge Halston leaned over a document, his glasses low on his nose, a pen clutched tightly in his fingers. His robes had been removed, replaced. With a simple gray shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, the vulnerability of his humanity now more evident than ever. He was not just a judge tonight. He was a man confronting a machine that had operated unchecked for years right beneath his bench. To his left sat the court clerk, furiously typing notes into a laptop, her eyes wide, her mouth taut with concentration. To his right, the bailiff, now more a sentry than an enforcer, stood silently by the door, his hand occasionally brushing the holster at his side, as if anticipating the sound of boots in the hallway. Pam's voice, though weary, was focused as a scalpel. This is the original forensics report, not the one submitted in court. This was filed and time-stamped 2 days prior. It contradicts every conclusion the defense relied on. Blood pattern analysis, DNA markers, everything. Judge Halston took the page from her and stared down at the report. His hands trembled slightly, but he steadied himself. And this technician, he gave you this? Pam nodded. He was blackmailed. They found out he had a sealed juvenile record. They told him they'd leak it to the press and his career would be over. He stayed quiet for years, until now. The judge looked up. You said you have someone else, a second witness. Pam reached for her phone and slid it across the table. The screen lit up with a paused video. This was taken 48 hours ago. He's a former detective, assigned to the case before it was handed off to another unit. His name's Travis Rule. He was told to stand down after he began asking about inconsistencies in the evidence. Log. He left the force 5 years ago. He's been in hiding ever since. She pressed play. The screen filled with the dimly lit image of a man in his late 40s, unshaven, his voice brittle and shaky but clear. They threatened me, he said. Not just career stuff. They said my wife's car would malfunction if I didn't. Drop it. I left the department the next day. I couldn't do it. I couldn't watch another case get rigged because someone with power needed a scapegoat. The judge stopped the video. Silence stretched for a long moment. Then he stood and moved toward the window, staring out into the inky blackness of the city. Lights flickered in distant buildings. Sirens wailed somewhere far away. He looked like a man staring into the very structure of the thing he had sworn to uphold, now questioning every pillar it was built upon. How did it get this bad? He whispered, not expecting an answer. Pam stood and stepped closer. It didn't happen overnight. It was decay, quiet, slow, and everyone who noticed was either silenced or complicit. I tried not to see it too. I was part of the same system. But the day I saw an innocent man walk into a cell because of someone else's ambition, that was the day I couldn't ignore it anymore. Judge Halston turned back to her, and his eyes were wet with something that looked like fury and shame, entwined. If I open this, if I call for a review, a mistrial, an investigation, it'll bring everything out. People will lose their positions. Lives will unravel. And you'll be targeted. Pam didn't flinch. I know. But I'd rather be hunted by men than haunted by silence. A long beat passed between them. 2 public servants standing on opposite ends of a moral chasm, now finally reaching across. He nodded slowly, as if sealing a vow with the universe. All right, he said. Tomorrow morning, I'm issuing a stay. The verdict will be frozen. I'll call for a sealed emergency hearing. If what you've presented holds under scrutiny, I will vacate the ruling and refer the matter to the state's oversight commission. But you must prepare. They won't let this happen quietly. Pam's voice was calm, resolute. I'm already being followed. I saw a black SUV outside my apartment last night. I've moved twice in 2 weeks. The judge's face hardened. We'll assign you security. You'll testify under protection, and I'll speak to the Chief Justice personally. No one silences truth under my watch again. He returned to the table and signed a provisional order, one that would put the current proceedings in stasis until a full review could be launched. As the pen lifted from the paper, it was as if something ancient and rusted deep within the heart of the court had finally groaned back to life. Justice, long buried beneath procedure and politics, stirred. Pam stared down at the order, her throat tightening with the weight of it all. They weren't just correcting one wrong. They were opening the floodgates. Outside, the wind picked up. The branches outside the courthouse window shivered in the dark. Somewhere in the city, someone was already making phone calls, already preparing to fight back, already deciding how to silence the voices that were about to rise. But Pam Bondi was no longer a lone figure shouting into a void. She was the storm now, and the storm was just beginning. The morning sun broke over the city like a slow explosion of pale gold and fractured blue. But inside the courthouse, there was no light warm enough to soften what was coming. The marble steps were already lined, with whispers, murmurs traveling faster than footsteps, eyes darting toward each other with unspoken questions. Something had shifted. Everyone could feel it. A tension in the bones of the building, as if the walls themselves were bracing for impact. Pam Bondi stood just inside the main hallway, flanked by 2 plainclothes officers. They weren't there to intimidate. They were there to shield. Her coat was buttoned high, hair pulled back, face a portrait of exhaustion sharpened by purpose. She clutched a thin case in one hand and a bundle of affidavits in the other. Her heels echoed across the marble with each step, no longer the sound of intrusion, but declaration. Courtroom 3B had been cleared. Only the essential parties were allowed inside: the judge, both legal teams, the clerk, a representative from the Oversight Commission who had arrived just after dawn, and a single security liaison. A hush had swallowed the room whole. No press. No public, not yet. This was the eye of the storm, the last breath before the walls either held or crumbled. Judge Halston entered from his chambers and took his seat with a gravity that was almost unbearable to witness. He looked different now, not older, not weaker, but forged. Like fire had touched his edges in the night, and he had stepped from it burned but intact. He gave a single nod to Pam as she took her seat at the auxiliary table. I've reviewed the documents submitted last night, he began, voice calm but serrated. I have verified 3 pieces of primary evidence that directly contradict the original trial record. I have reviewed a video testimony from a former law enforcement officer and a notarized confession from a certified forensics technician. I am prepared, barring any last-minute legal obstruction, to vacate the verdict. The defense attorney, Caro, shot to his feet, his voice tight with desperation disguised as professionalism. Your Honor, this is an overreach. A dangerous precedent. You are choosing to believe an unvetted witness and an attorney acting outside the scope of this trial. We demand a full evidentiary hearing before any motion is executed. At minimum, we deserve the right to cross-examine. Judge Halston's eyes narrowed. And you will have that right. But you do not have the right to bury misconduct under layers of delay. I am issuing a stay of sentencing effective immediately. This court will reconvene within 72 hours for a formal evidentiary hearing. During that time, all related files will be submitted to the State Commission for Judicial Integrity. The Oversight Commissioner leaned forward slightly, hands folded on the table. She spoke only once, but her words fell like a quiet detonation. We have opened a preliminary inquiry. Subpoenas will be issued today. Anyone found to have tampered with evidence in this case will be prosecuted under state and federal law. Pam didn't move. She didn't blink, but inside her lungs ached with something close to release. It wasn't over. Not even close. But for the first time, the truth had a foothold. Caro sat back, seething, his eyes sliding toward Pam with a hatred that tried and failed to hide its fear. He knew the moment had slipped beyond his grasp. The machine he relied on, the network of silence and shadow deals, had sprung a leak. And through that breach, a flood was coming. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and the witness walked in. Travis Rule moved slowly, every step deliberate, like a man approaching his own execution, but refusing to look away. He wore a faded coat and carried a file box under one arm, which he placed on the table with a soft thud. His face bore the scars of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. But today, he would speak. He was sworn in. He sat. And then he began. He told them about the night he was pulled off the investigation, how a supervisor he trusted took him aside and told him gently to look the other way. He described watching a piece of evidence disappear from the log, only to be replaced by something that fit the prosecution's narrative too perfectly. He named names. He gave dates. He showed emails he'd printed out before he left the department. He even played a voicemail from an anonymous number, warning him not to choke on your conscience. As he spoke, the courtroom changed. It no longer felt like a room where verdicts were issued. It became something rawer, older, a tribunal, where truth itself had come to testify. People didn't shift in their seats. They didn't take notes. They just listened. The silence in the room became sacred. Pam watched the judge closely. Every so often, his hand would tighten on his pen. His jaw would flex. A breath would hitch just before he wrote something down. She knew what he was doing. He was calculating the collapse, not just of one case, but the echo it would send through everything connected to it: appeals, retrials, resignations. The cascade. By the time Travis finished, there was no air left in the room. He sat back, eyes hollow but unbroken, and said simply, "That's all I have, Your Honor." Judge Halston leaned forward, elbows on the bench, hands folded. His voice, when it came, was softer than before, but heavier too. "Mr. Rule, what you've done today may have cost you safety, privacy, perhaps even your future. But I want you to know, this court recognizes your courage, and it will not be wasted." He turned to the room. "This court is now adjourned until the formal evidentiary hearing. All parties are ordered to prepare for a full presentation of supplemental materials. This case, and others related, will be reopened." The gavel struck. The sound was not loud, but final. As people began to rise, Pam remained seated, her fingers laced together tightly on the table. Her pulse thudded in her ears. It was beginning. The reckoning. The unraveling. And somewhere out there, in boardrooms, in offices, in the shadows where deals were once made without fear, people were beginning to panic. They should. The hallway outside the courtroom was no longer silent. Word had begun to spread like wildfire through the courthouse, first in whispers, then in hurried steps, then in ringing phones and rapidly typed messages. Pam stepped out of the double doors into a world that had changed while she was inside. The truth had been spoken, and even though the sky outside remained bright and crisp, something heavy hung in the air. The weight of inevitability. Reporters were gathering at the barricades that had been set up hours earlier. Though no official statement had yet been made, the scent of scandal had drawn them in like wolves to blood. Pam didn't stop. She moved with purpose through the chaos, her security detail flanking her as they guided her down the marble corridor. But it wasn't fear that pushed her forward now. It was momentum. Truth was no longer a hope. It was a weapon. Behind her, the courthouse doors remained shut. Inside, Judge Halston had returned to his chambers and immediately picked up the phone. Not to a colleague, not to a staffer, but to the Chief Justice himself. His voice was low, controlled, but each word carved deeper into the foundation of a broken system. He didn't ask for permission. He gave notice. This was no longer about one case. It was about purging rot from a temple of justice long since corrupted. Pam's car was waiting. As she stepped inside, she saw them, The men in suits across the street pretending to read newspapers, checking their watches. Surveillance. Not the kind that protected, the kind that warned. She stared back, letting them see her see them. Letting them know, I am not afraid. Back at her apartment, her third in a month, one of many places she rotated through to avoid becoming predictable, she peeled off her coat and sat by the window. Her phone buzzed nonstop, emails, voicemails, threats and thanks, anonymous messages, but also names, new names, more people willing to speak, to come forward. The dam was breaking. The Oversight Commission called before midnight. They had launched a formal investigation into the Forensics Division. Subpoenas had gone out. The district attorney's office had gone quiet, too quiet. Rumors swirled that resignations were already being drafted behind locked doors. One name whispered through. Channels Pam had long learned to trust was said to be preparing to flee the state. She watched the city lights shimmer through the glass, blinking against the black. Somewhere out there, the man who had nearly gone to prison, innocent, abandoned, sat in a holding cell, unaware that his freedom now moved like a rising tide, inevitable and unstoppable. The next day, it was front-page news. Judge Vacate's ruling after explosive revelation in trial. Corruption probe launched. Pam's face wasn't in the article. That had been her condition. This wasn't about fame. It wasn't about credit. It was about consequence. But her name whispered in corners now, among lawyers, among investigators, among those who had once laughed off the possibility that someone like her, sharp, relentless, unyielding, could ever threaten the comfort of power. Within a week, the forensic lab was shut down pending review. 2 technicians disappeared. The janitor who had made that first call to Pam was placed under protection. The Oversight Commission held late-night hearings under armed guard, and one by one the pillars of the false case collapsed. Pam attended the evidentiary hearing, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Travis Rule returned to the stand, this time in front of cameras. The judge moved with absolute certainty, the gavel falling with rhythm, not rage. Orders were signed, files were unsealed, and the man wrongly accused, whose name had become a symbol of failure, was brought into the light, exonerated fully, charges erased like ink in water. As he walked free, he stopped by Pam. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her with eyes that had seen too much darkness and finally found a sliver of light. She gave him a small nod, her throat tight, eyes gleaming with restrained emotion. He said one thing. You gave me back my life. Pam looked at him, voice almost a whisper. No, you held on to it. I just helped open the door. Later that evening, as the sun dipped into the horizon and painted the city in bruised gold and rose, Pam stood on the roof of her building. Wind whipped at her coat. Behind her, the world stirred, angry, exposed, bracing for what came next. This wasn't over. More names were rising to the surface, more witnesses, more ghosts of cases lost. But now people knew her name. They knew someone was watching. Someone would not be silenced. Someone would speak. Pam Bondi had interrupted a trial, and in doing so had turned the tide of justice, not just for one man, but for all who had ever been buried beneath the weight of lies.